The inspiring life story of KFC's Colonel Sanders. Colonel Sanders, whether you know him by name or not, is probably the most recognizable icon in the fast food industry. A glance at his iconic face, and the first thing that comes to mind is the chicken and their global franchise. His face has been a part of the KFC brand before KFC was a thing, and it's almost impossible to imagine the company without its mascot. Colonel Sanders' face may be everywhere, but most people don't know much about the man himself. The bulk of what you may have heard about him, such as him attempting suicide after a series of failed businesses, or that he tried kidnapping his own daughter and he eventually retired a billionaire, are the best myths perpetuated across the internet by motivational speakers to inspire LinkedIn entrepreneurs and bored late boomers. This is the inspiring story of Colonel Harland Sanders, a man whose life story is another reason to turn the lemons life gives you into lemonade. Colonel Sanders was born on a small farm in Henryville, Indiana on September 9, 1890. He is the man famed for creating a fried chicken recipe that launched the world's largest fast food chain, Kentucky Fried Chicken. Before the age of 6, he'd lost his dad, Wilbert Sanders, forcing his mother to take up menial jobs like working at a local canning factory and sewing for nearby families. Her demanding work life meant that she was mostly away from her kids, leaving Sanders to take care of his other 3 siblings. This is where he started honing his culinary skills. By the time he was 10, he had begun to work at a local farm. At age 12, his mother remarried and took Sanders and his siblings with her to live with her new husband in the suburbs just outside of Indianapolis. Sanders never liked his stepfather, and their relationship went south pretty quickly, with fights and arguments being the order of the day. After just a year, Sanders was sent back to Clark County, where his family had first lived. Now back at where he spent his early years, 13-year-old Sanders got a job working on a farm in Greenwood, Indiana, earning in the ballpark of $10 and $15. The position also came with a room and board. His job was to feed animals and perform odd tasks. Around this time, young Sanders was struggling to balance his farm work with his full-time education. Eventually, his need to sustain himself won, and he dropped out of school, only completing the 6th grade. Sanders later blamed his decision to quit school on algebra, stating, "Algebra's what drove me off." Aged only, he enlisted for the United States Army and was picked out, but was dishonorably discharged 1 year later on the grounds that he'd faked his age. From there, he got hired as a laborer for the railway. A few months into that, he got fired for fighting a co-worker. While he worked for the railway, Sanders was smart enough to study law, so he had something to fall back to. Sadly, he also messed that up by getting into another fight. Sanders, now fed up with life, moved back in with his mom, hoping the change of scenery would change his luck. He eventually got a job selling life insurance. However, as you might have guessed, he got fired for insubordination. The guy simply couldn't catch a break, but he kept on pushing. So in 1920, he founded a ferry boat company, which he later cashed in to create a lamp manufacturing company. But unfortunately, a company was already selling a better version of the lamps at the time. Within 28 years, he'd served in the U.S. Army, which saw him get deployed to Cuba, worked as a streetcar conductor, an insurance salesman, a railroad fireman, a secretary, a ferry operator, a tire salesman, a lawyer, and even a midwife. Business wasn't the only thing Sanders sucked at. After getting married to Josephine King in 1908, aged 18, the couple had 3 kids, a son and 2 daughters. But because of his inability to hold down a job, they divorced in 1947, with Josephine taking the kids with her. Another disaster struck when he lost his only son, Harlan Jr., to complications from blood poisoning he contracted during a tonsillectomy. According to John Ed Pierce, a contributor to Sanders' biography, Sanders was depressed for a period during his adult life, and it's easy to see why. Sanders would eventually remarry a woman named Claudia Lettington in 1949, who he remained married to until he died in 1980. At 40, he bought a burnt-down gas station along with its restaurant, and this determined man rebuilt it and made it operational again. He cooked and sold meals to those who stopped at the station. The food he sold included pan-fried chicken, string beans, ham, okra, and hot biscuits. His meals earned him some reputation in town, and sales went up appreciably. A few years down the line, Sanders took out the pumps and set up his first restaurant. At this point, Sanders had begun to perfect the recipe for his secret chicken recipe. By 1939, his streak grew hotter when he developed a method to cook the chicken with less grease but with preserved flavor using a pressure cooker. After being commissioned as a Kentucky colonel in 1950 by Governor Lawrence Weatherby, Sanders began to dress the part. First, he grew a goatee and wore a black frock coat before later switching to a white suit, a string tie, and referring to himself as Colonel. His restaurant enjoyed success for a decade, but another bout of tragedy struck. In the 50s, the highway junction in front of his restaurant was moved to another location, ending the heavy traffic that brought customers. After that, Sanders got wind of a new interstate highway that would see his restaurant demolished. It promptly auctioned off the site of his restaurant, taking a hefty loss in the process. With no source of income, he had to scrape by, living on his savings, the auction proceeds, and a monthly $105 Social Security check. A man who'd tasted success for the first time in his life was now back to ground zero. The closure of his restaurant got Sanders thinking, and he came up with an ingenious idea. He traveled across the United States looking for potential franchisee restaurants, offering them his secret chicken recipe in exchange for 4 cents on every chicken they sold. As expected, this was no easy task to undergo. Sanders would wander across the country looking for suitable restaurants. Once he found one, he'd offer to cook some chicken for the restaurant's customers. If they agreed, he'd then suggest cooking for their customers for a few days. The plan was to let this restaurant have a feel of what his chicken tasted like, and if they liked it, they'd enter into negotiations to begin franchising for Sanders. Slowly, humiliatingly, but surely, he began to win business partners, with Pete Harmon being his first franchisee. All the while, his wife and himself lived out of his car and begged from friends to eat. By 1964, he franchised over 600 outlets and built a company worth millions of dollars. Finally, at age 74, Colonel Sanders had successfully owned a thriving business with 17 employees, an office space of his own, and a handsome profit margin. His company soon caught the eye of young investors. John Y. Brown Jr., a 29-year-old lawyer from Kentucky, along with his millionaire patron Jack Macy, soon tried to convince Sanders to sell his company. Sanders initially vehemently declined, but after being assured that his recipe and legacy would be preserved, he gave in. He sold the company for $2 million and got a down payment of $50,000, the company's assets in Canada, and a salary of $40,000 yearly for life. After he sold KFC, his role was not yet over. He traveled over 200,000 miles every year promoting KFC around the world, appeared on television, and visited individual restaurants as a spokesperson for the company. He remained the face of KFC even after he sold it. His determination and persistence encouraged customers. Consequently, Sanders became a figure in American cultural history, and his image remains widely used in KFC advertising. Brown sold the company to Hubline Incorporated in 1971, which Colonel Sanders believed wasn't running the business correctly. Later, Colonel Sanders and his wife decided to start a new restaurant and started serving the original signature KFC-style chicken. They named the restaurant the Colonel's Lady. Unfortunately, KFC's owners threatened to sue Colonel Sanders, insisting he no longer had the right to use his name. He obliged and changed it to Colonel Lady's Dinner House, but the new owners insisted they owned the right to the word Colonel. Raged and frustrated, Sanders decided to sue the company he began for $122 million. KFC countersued for trademark infringement. The terms on which the lawsuit ended were not disclosed when it was settled in 1975. David Sanders as a source of inspiration. David Sanders was rejected 1,009 times before he became the man he is today. Life is work happened to be a saying that kept him going. He grew up in his ordeals to be a great entrepreneur, surviving the Great Depression. In his later years, Sanders also found religion. He'd occasionally appeared on evangelical Christian television shows. He'd also donated a chunk of his wealth to charities like the Salvation Army. He died of leukemia at the age of 90 on December 16, 1980. His body was laid in state at the Kentucky State Capitol before he was buried in Cave Hill, Louisville, Kentucky. KFC has become one of the U.S. fast food branches and opened many restaurants around the world. That's all we have time for today. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. See you in the next one.